to do is tell you who I am, and then I need to know who each of you is around the table, just to have some idea of what we can talk about, etc. My name is Wally Congdon. I'm actually an attorney in private practice here in Missoula. By education, I'm a geographer by undergraduate training. Most of my master's in town planning, which is not quite yet done, is from Massey University in Palmerston North, New Zealand, which is Missoula's sister city. And my JD in laws is from University of Montana, which is where I went to school, etc. I kind of do planning and land stuff by choice more than by accident, and that the geography and the planning kind of orient themselves towards that. And if the rest of you can tell me who you are and tell each other who you are, that would be appropriate.
I'm Linda Kickard. I'm an alternate.
Okay. And you do what? You work where?
I work for the Department of Revenue.
Okay.
I'm the assistant supervisor for this area.
Okay.
I've been on the board for 2 years now, and I think my husband thinks my occupation is professional volunteer.
So 2 of you were here last time we went through this. Was anybody else? 3 of you. Okay, 3 of you. All right, for those of you who were here before, some of this will be repetitive, and I apologize for that. The reason being that I was kind of given some quasi-instructions about what we were to cover this evening. So part of tonight is a repeat of before, and another portion of this evening kind of concentrates or zooms in on one part of that. I guess the other thing is this. In terms of what I'm going to say and what I'm going to do, I want to preface that with a couple of comments that I think are appropriate to what you're doing and where you're going. And I think that you should try to keep those in mind as you go through the next 1, 2, or 3 years of your term. I am not the audience that you need to target yourselves to. Nick Kaufman is not the audience you need to target yourselves to. To a degree, Eli is not. To a degree, the people at Sorensen and the rest of them are not. Kate, to a point, isn't. I think a number of you who have some idea about planning, about zoning, about subdivision, about those sorts of things, are not the people that are your target audience at all. Those of you who are from the Forest Service, those of you who deal with issues related to architecture, to design, to layout of properties, etc., those are not the persons that you need to target your message to. Take a look at yourselves. Just kind of think for a second about who's in the room with you right now. And I think what you'll see is an exceptional number of persons, or an excessive number of persons, who are interested in planning, zoning, regulation, subdivision, etc. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. Unfortunately, because of that, the majority of the work you do and the majority of message that you send and the majority of what goes on in your meetings is oriented around things that you know about. There are, 6 planners in the room at this point in time, a couple of architects, etc., people who are associated with the work. That being the case, I think you can kind of look at that and explain to yourself, why is it that you never hear of somebody quoting in the Missoulian, the planning board did a wonderful job of looking this thing over instead of that bunch of pinko commie faggots down in the courthouse are trying to take away my land. And I assure you, pinko commie faggots is mild compared to what you hear on the street most of the time. I mean, in simple terms, the reason you hear that is twofold. One, the people that you are and the people you often deal with on a regular basis are persons who have an idea about what's going on, about what you're trying to do, about how the system works, okay? And number 2, the regulations you've got and the rules that we have tend to not be proactive. They are almost always reactive. Why do you have zoning? Why do you have a master plan for? But go to the basic question. I mean, a master plan is nothing, okay? It's a great document, and it says a whole bunch of stuff about where you're going, and you have to use it, and it's the whole thing you base what you're doing on. But at the same time, on the street in Missoula, Montana, or Bozeman, or Billings, or Spokane, or New York City, a master plan means 0, okay? If you violate the master plan, what happens to you in Missoula, Montana? Barbara, what happens? Right, not a whole lot means what happens is nothing, okay? There's nothing that says if you violate the master plan, you get fined. If you violate the master plan, you go to jail. You can pass go, you can still collect $200, okay? The implementing legislation is called what? It's called, go ahead. What implements the plan on the ground? What's it called? This is the Z word. It's not called subdivision regs, though. What really puts the plan into place on the ground? Zoning. Okay? Isn't the zoning ordinance out there on the street that says this is going to be an R1 family zone or an R5 family zone or an industrial 1 or commercial type of overlay? Isn't that the thing that on the ground implements the regulation? Sure it is. And why is there zoning? Why is there an ordinance that says you will not build a pig farm at 445 Brook Street? You ever see a pig farm at 445 Brooks? You know what it looks like? More important than that, do you know what it smells like? That is reactive, okay? So the implementing legislation you've got isn't something which sits down and says, hi, we want to help you. We're here to do you a favor. I mean, in theory it does. It promotes those three wonderful words, public health, safety, and welfare. And if you don't know them now, in 3 years, I promise all of you will. That's what it in theory does. But the implementing legislation on the ground that says, Mr. Jones, you cannot build the following things, is reactive. It's a reaction to something which went in a neighborhood 30 or 40 or 50 or 70 years ago, and it's reactive in that what you're trying to do is stop the same thing from happening somewhere else by limiting or ending people's ability to do something. So when somebody walks in the door during the planning board meeting once every, what is it, third Thursday now? Second Tuesday? I can't remember. First Tuesday. Okay, so how long since I've been. When somebody walks in the door next door, there's two strikes against you. Strike one is your implementing tool out there on the ground is going to tell these people, you cannot. All right? You can't do it. The deck is stacked. Automatically, when they walk in the door, the reason they're there is because you've told them no. All right? And the zoning ordinance generally is what does that. And the second strike against you is what? When 90%, when 60% of the people walk in the door out there, what is it that they've never been through before? And with luck, will never go through again. Just talk to them, ask them and see. What is it they've never done before? A public hearing before a planning board, a board of adjustment, or whatever else, okay? So there's 5 or 6 or 8 people. How many people do you see on a regular basis? Those of you who've been around for a long time. You can count the names on what, both hands? 10, 8, 6? Okay? So even if there's those same 10 people, or 6 people, or 3 of those 10 show up at every meeting, at almost every meeting there's 1 or 2 other people who've never been before you in the past and who will never be before you again. And when they walk in, strike one is you've already told them no, or you're going to tell them no, and they know you're going to tell them no. And strike two is the fact that, what? They don't know what's going to happen. They have no idea. Those are the people you need to target yourself for. If you tell me no, if you tell Eli no, you tell Gary Stinsatter no, you tell Nick Kaufman no. We know why you're telling us no. We know the reasons why you told us no, whether you write them down or not. And we're not going to go down to the Missouri the next day and say these communists at the planning board did whatever else. Okay? You tell John Doe no, who didn't know what was going to happen, who didn't have any idea how the proceeding was going to go, who didn't know what you were doing or why you were doing it, are you going to be a popular camper? And is that the person who writes a letter to the editor that says those communists at the courthouse did whatever? You bet it is. Is that the person who gives planning, zoning, etc. a bad name? You bet. And there's a lot of them. Because that's 6 or 8 people you tell no that know what's going on. They don't mind. And they'll be back next month with something else, and you can tell them no again or yes again at that point in time, and it's not personal. You tell 3 Mr. Joneses a month no for 1 year, and you've told 36 Mr. Joneses no. Now, you multiply that times 20 years, and how many people do you have, and how many of them talk to their neighbors? None of them, right? Go to Clinton and talk to those people when they wanted to, quote, secede from the county. Go to Potomac and talk to those folks when they want to do the same thing. So the people you need to target for, the people you need to address your message to, that you need to run your meeting for, are not me. And I will tell you that up front. They're not the planners you've got here. They're not the people you see on a regular basis. The people you have to target for are the people who do not know what's going on. Second thing, 90% of all zoning, subdivision, planning litigation doesn't come from people who knew what the agenda was. They come from people who walk in the door and have no clue about what's going on, so they don't get the result they want because they weren't prepared in the first place, but it's your fault they didn't get that. And number 2, they happen to have a very large pocketbook, and they can afford to go out and hire a couple of lawyers. It's going to cost them $25,000 or $30,000 and take you to someplace fun like the Supreme Court of the United States. And in 1925 come down with a decision like Euclid versus Ambler Realty, which still gives us the nasty, awful, gross zoning we have to this day. Case is what, 65 years old now? And it's still the binding law. Read a Supreme Court opinion written this year, and what will they cite? Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company. Somebody happened to have some money, somebody'd never been through the system, but somebody had the bucks to take it the whole way. So when you make a mistake, it's not the mistake you make with me, or Nick Kaufman, or Eli, or Gary, or whoever that's going to cause you the problem. When you make a mistake with somebody who happens to have the bucks to back up the fact and figure out that you made a mistake, you end up in litigation. And Missoula County has a wonderful history of the same. Probably 60% of the zoning law in the state came out of this county. Probably 60 or 70% of the subdivision law in the state came out of this county. Go back to the 70s, okay? The only people who were more productive in 1975 at making planning law in Montana were the Kalispell County Commissioners. They got to the Supreme Court 3 times on one case. It's a new record. Other than that, Missoula County has been real productive, and those 2 counties are probably 90% of the law in the state on the subject. Okay? The reason they got there wasn't decisions that came out of this board usually, it was the decisions that came out of the city council and out of the county. They weren't bad decisions, they just weren't quite done correctly, not in regards to the process, but in regards of targeting the message and what they were doing to their audience, to their recipient, who happened to be the applicant. So with that as a preface comment, the one thing I'd add, I'm guilty of doing the same thing that you sometimes will find yourself doing. I'm one of the supervisors for the County Conservation District, which happens to do all the 310 permits on all the rivers and streams that you want to build any sort of project on in Missoula County. And we have the authority to tax, separate of the commissioners. We can take 1.5 mils for our budget. And it's really easy when you see the same 3 people to treat everybody the same way. And when John Q. Different walks in the front door, all of a sudden your mind has to go, wait a second. The best way to get John Q. somebody different to understand why we're doing this is to ask him, John Q. Public, what would you do if it was your neighbor applying to build a pig farm at 437 Brooks? And you didn't want one there. And all of a sudden the context changes. So I think that's enough precatory comment, but keep that in mind, I think, relative to the whole process. I've given you 3 things tonight. I don't want you to read them right now. One of them we will read together later. We're going to march through one of them, and one of them we're going to use as samples. The first is an article called Due Process, The Elements of Fair Play. Some of you have read it in the past if you went through one of these proceedings. It is getting dated. It was actually published by R. Marlin Smith in 1979, so it is 13 years old. Every now and then in a fit of zealousness, I tell myself I'm going to go to the law library and update the cases in it. And then I do that. What I find out is the law hasn't changed a whole lot, so I haven't written down the new citations. What it is the best article that's in layman's terms that explains to you the nuts and bolts of the planning process. It's simple, it's easy to read, it's straightforward. What it tells you is that what you need to do in regards to being an entity, okay? A quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial, quasi-regulatory, kind of here we are, we can do things, but we can't really do things, body, are the following things, and they're set forth in there. First of all, it tells you have to meet 2 things. One is procedural due process, which is how you go about making a regulation, and the second is substantive due process. And I want to talk about the second first, because the second one doesn't take very long, number 1, and number 2, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it this evening. If you look back to page 170, which is the 3rd page from the back of that handout, what you see is a 3-page discussion on the question of substantive due process and what it is. Page 171 says, the rule that a regulation, this is the first paragraph on 171, the rule that regulation must meet substantive due process, and you won't know what that word is yet, I still don't after a lot of years, standards usually means in the context of zoning ordinances that the question of whether an ordinance meets or does not meet that test depends in part on whether there is a reasonable use to which the property can be devoted to under the restrictions in question. In more simple language, substantive due process is simply the question of, does the means by which you're regulating, does the end justify the means? Is the means the least restrictive to still give the landowner the right to do something? Okay? Downtown Missoula, let's say someplace functional and nice like the Turf Bar and Cafe burns to the ground. I think you've probably heard this scenario before. The Turf Bar and Cafe used to be next to the Montgomery Wards building. I think a number of you know where that is. It's what, Montana Bank now? Montana Bank building in the corner? When the turf burned to the ground, what the turf had left was a standing hulk and shell. And downtown Missoula at that point in time was zoned to provide for basically commercial development on the site. Let's say the planning board comes along, let's say the commissioners come along, let's say city council comes along, whoever, and says, you know, We need some open space in downtown Missoula. We need not just a park on the river, but we need a park that is adjacent to where people want to eat lunch. So what do we rezone the turf bar, plaza, and that end of the block to be? Come on, you guys, be creative. What do we zone it to be?
Park.
A park, yeah. What's the zoning designation? I mean, speak up. You guys need to participate or you're not going to. What is it? Come on.
P1, I think.
Okay, P1. We're going to zone it as a park. At that point in time, is there something reasonable the owner of the park can use the property for?
No.
No. I mean, what can he do with it, okay? Go out to the airport. What's at the end of the airport runway? Not everybody at once. Come on, what's at the end of the airport runway? Well, there's nothing, but what is it? I mean, what's there?
Open ground.
Open ground. And what do they do on the open ground?
Pasture.
Great. And that pasture, are we going to rezone it? Come on, you guys. Are we going to rezone it?
Probably not.
Why not? Now, just a minute. Why not? Why rezone it? What do we want to rezone it for?
All right.
How? Oh, come on now. The paper should never again say communist. It should say rabble-rousers at Missoula County. Come on, what are we going to rezone the end of the runway for? It's farmland. It's used to graze cows on and to grow grain on. What are we going to rezone it for? What are we going to zone it as?
Industrial?
Oh, come on. Look at the latest. What was the last proposal that they proposed? Not commercial. What was it? Come on, you guys. Planners, help me out. This is the big P&O term. No, parks and open space. Okay? The last drafted proposal said we want to zone the end of the airport runway, parks and open space. Now, why do we want to zone it that way?
So no one will build on it.
So no one will build on it. And why don't we want them to build on it? Come on, you guys. Why not?
First of all, you have
Crazy
obstruction
deal there
clearance,
anyway.
Okay, clearance. Clearance for what?
obstruction clearance for
Right.
aircraft. Then you've got.
Aircraft.
Well, yeah.
Right, airplanes.
Noise complaints from
Right.
the community.
What happens at the end of the runway? Yeah, yeah, falling luggage. I love it. You must fly with Northwest disoriented. Anyway, yeah, when you're standing there looking up, what goes over your head? Airplanes all the time. Do you want to have somebody put a 72-story building at the end of the runway? Practical use? No way. Downtown Missoula, do you want a 72-story building? Let's make it Missoula. Do you want a 10-story building at the side of the turf? Why not? In fact, where the parking structure is, could you have built a nice 10-story building there?
Yes.
Sure. Would it have been a problem? Traffic, access? No, parking would have been a nightmare, but no worse than it is now in a way. Yeah, not a problem at all. So put a 10-story building there. Is it reasonable to zone that ground for parks and open space? No. Does that seem fair and reasonable to you to zone it that way? No. What's your gut doing? Major uproar. This is not the right result here. Okay? Into the runway. We have an air traffic controller. Into the runway. Is it reasonable to, in the master plan, zone that for parks and open space?
Yes, of course. I believe it is.
Not necessarily. It isn't hurting anybody the way it is, and if you grow green and hay along the side of the runway, why not off the end?
Ah, now, west end of airport runway, 1969. Person comes in and says, you know what we need here? What we need is a facility to store our grain in. So what we're going to do on this site is we're going to build a grain terminal and stick up two 165-foot tall grain elevators, complete with pipes, tubes, plumbing, the whole business. Stick them up in the air, and a radio tower would be really nice, because if you've got those obstructions already, why not stick a radio tower next to it, okay? What's the reaction that Missoula County has to that? Well, aside from are you crazy, what's the first thing we do? What do you zone the east end of the runway? Sure, and why do you? It's reactive, okay? So the bottom line is it reasonable to make the park in downtown Missoula? No, it's not. Substantive due process, okay? In versus mean says that is not a reasonable result. At the same time, Missoula Airport Runway, and there's a little dissension among you, but I hear you a lot more comfortable zoning that parks and open space than the turf bar property. I mean, the little red lights that go off in your stomach to say this is not a good result, over here are screaming, yelling, and shouting and burning holes in your stomach, and out at the airport are going, well, I mean, it doesn't hurt anything to leave it the way it is. What's the reason you zone it parks and open space? Why do you do it now? So you can't build the grain silos at the end, okay?
Because we already have too many ducks and geese off the approach and along the downwind legs, and it's a real hazard.
Ducks and
I
geese.
don't want any grain out there.
Yeah.
Dangerous.
Okay, that's the next thing.
Reason to rezone.
Do we zone out farming then? I mean, how far do you go? Do you say you can only use it for parks and open space? And if you say it can only be parks, and open space, and it can't be agriculture, or it can only be cows grazing because they'll eat the grass down, but no grain. At that point in time, if you kind of pass some substantive point when the means, i.e. regulating use completely, doesn't justify the end.
I think it would be okay to have its own commercial.
Okay.
You could have it parked and open with a variance for agriculture, and that variance would depend on how long it's going to be used.
A variance. A variance. So are you suggesting that somebody who can maybe hire a lawyer, come in, argue about variances, and make a huge flash presentation? What?
You don't need one for it.
Right. Are you suggesting that maybe we're going to treat one owner at the end of the runway one way, and then we're going to treat one owner at the end of the runway a different way?
No, what I'm saying is you already have agricultural use, so you're not changing it.
Mm-hmm.
But you are going to change it as far as the zoning, but you're going to permit.
The existing use.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll let the existing use go ahead. Okay, I think that's all right. There you've at least solved the problem for what exists now. It's not going to get any worse. And maybe that's the most acceptable way to regulate.
The reason why you're thinking about changing it is because you want to, in other words, keep it open, but you also should allow the present use.
Okay, I think you're on the right track exactly. The best substantive due process question you can ask yourself is what I call the tummy test. And I think you guys probably giggled at this before. The tummy test is ridiculous. People look at that and go, the tummy test, what's that? The tummy test is something that I can't legally describe to you, okay? Read all the Supreme Court opinions, read the codes of the state of Montana, read whatever you want to read. You will not find anywhere listed something called the tummy test, okay? This list of due process in here, procedural due process, nothing in here says take the tummy test, okay? I can't find it written anywhere.
What you're saying is if you don't throw up, it's all right.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't quite have to be that blatant though, okay? In simple terms, the tummy test I think is what you just had. In terms of substantive due process, what I just asked you to do is sit down and look at the turf, which may be excessive when I say we need parks and open space. But I think a decision to zone that as parks and open space, all of you find offensive. None of you look comfortable. People start sitting back and going like this. Your nonverbals are telling me, okay? You're kind of going, oh, parks and open space in downtown Missoula. God, that commercial building, it was great, it was wonderful, look what we've done to the landowner. All of a sudden when I say, hey, zone the end of the runway parks and open space, same regulation, same exact written ordinance, it's a whole lot more comfortable. In your gut, the tummy test, call it fairness, call it justice, call it equity, call it growing up in Western civilization. I mean, all of you went to close to the same schools, you got close to the same subjects, you took math, history, science, whatever else. It's not like you're little blueprints of each other, but in a lot of ways you're close. That thing going off in all of your stomachs is the tummy test. The first thing I tell people to ask themselves when you look at any decision regarding anything, and you're going to make it, isn't, well, let's see, we've got these 11 criteria regarding zoning, we've got whatever else. Because if you're starting there, to me, you shouldn't be doing the job you're doing. You're not asking yourself the first basic question. Call it common sense, call it whatever else, but in your gut something says, is this right or is this wrong? And about 99 times out of 100, you will find that your first impression is the way you ought to go.
We just had a thing, or article come before us where that tummy test really came in for me. And it was over there by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. They wanted to rezone it. It got annexed into the city, and they wanted to rezone it from a spot that was industrial to commercial because that's what our master plan told us to. And, you know, the owner was there, and he said, well, you know, it's been industrial forever, and it would really ruin the value of our land because we'd feel we'd lose an access there, and he went through a whole list of stuff. Then right next door is industrial, and down the road's quite a bit industrial too, on the road, which is what they were trying to get rid of. Well, we discussed and fussed about it there for a while, and it came pretty close vote. I think it was 5-4 against rezoning it to commercial rather than we said to leave it industrial. But tummy test sometimes doesn't mean the same to some people just per that vote as it does to other people. Because to me it stunk, and other people, especially Troy, just couldn't. He said, that's the master plan, we gotta follow this master plan.
It depends on how much Maalox.
But I say this tummy test is great. There's sometimes it's pretty much who has which way their tummy is.
There is, but I think you're auxiliary. That's the perfect point, Bill. Yeah, but that's the idea. I mean, you're at the perfect stage. That tummy test says all of you have kind of close to the same tummy test. And what I'm saying is when it's the turf bar, is there anybody in here who thinks that zoning the turf bar parks and open space would be reasonable? Is there anybody who wants to take that position? How many?
I think first of all, you have to look at property rights, the owner of the.
Yeah, but that's part of the test. I mean, you go back to what he can do with it. Look at the airport. How many of you think zoning the airport, the ends of the runways, okay, parks and open space, would be reasonable?
I mean, to exaggerate the thing, property, one little lot is worth $100,000 to the landowner, and then the city's gonna come in and say, we're gonna make this parks and open spaces, we'll pay you $10,000 for that land. There's a discrepancy there.
There is. Yeah, there is. But I want to get back to what Bill's talking about for a second. In the easy extreme of the turf bar, I think it's real easy for you to say, no, that shouldn't be done. I mean, all of your tummies are at the same place there. At the airport runway, is there anybody who thinks it's unreasonable to zone that parks and open space?
I guess I do.
Speak up. Why?
You know, I'm really concerned about loss of agricultural land.
Mhm.
And the fact that here is a place where there's farming, where apparently there's grain growing, it might be fertile area.
Mhm.
I don't think it should go into a park. It should
Mhm.
stay agricultural. And that's a heritage that we have here that
Mhm.
we shouldn't lose.
Mm-hmm. What's a goose do when it goes to the motor of a 727?
Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe some dead people.
Okay. Pile up.
Maybe several $1 million worth of aircraft damage.
Okay.
You can't even begin to count the cost of all the lives lost.
Okay. A plane takes off the runway headed east. What's 1 1/8 miles off the end of the runway? Right under the flight plan.
Grade school.
Which grade school?
Okay.
How many people go to school there?
600.
790 the last count. You know what a 727 piling into that building would do? How many people think it's reasonable to zone the airport open space and parks at the end of the
I think
runway?
it's very reasonable.
Okay, all of a sudden, I mean, I see your point, and it's perfect, Catherine, but I mean, the ante can go up both ways. I mean, I hear what you're saying. It's like, no, we need to preserve agricultural land. But I think overall, on balance, it's real easy there to say, all of your tummy tests, for the most part, says, well, that's reasonable. And I think if somebody comes back to you and says, now look, if you run a goose through the engine of a 727, you could crash it into that school, all of a sudden it's hard to beat dead bodies. Okay? Now, at that point in time, I'll get to you in 1 second. I think what you see is everybody's tummy test on one end is kind of the same, and everybody's tummy test on the other end is kind of the same. The point you bring up is what Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in one of the nicest decisions ever, which is, quote, the issues we deal with are issues about which reasonable persons of reasonable intelligence and reasonable education can reasonably analyze and arrive at reasonably different conclusions. So the tummy test in the middle is different. I mean, you're not always going to agree, and it's not personal. It has little to do with education. It has little to do with whatever may be life experience or analysis or how you look at things is what affects it. The ends are easy, okay? That's black and that's white. The hard one is when you get to the gray in the center. As well, it's the gray in the center when you're telling somebody no on a 5-4 vote that makes those people walk out of that room really angry. Okay? It's not often 10-0 that you say no, or 10-0 that you say yes. Go ahead.
Changing the zoning to parks and recreation is not going to ensure that there aren't going to be any geese there. I've seen more geese in parks
True.
than anywhere else.
Yeah,
And secondly, if you make it a park, I don't know who's going to go there
true.
because of the noise and the stink.
Mhm.
So
Good point. Does changing it to parks and and recreation or parks and open space eliminate the chance of an accident? Does it lessen it?
Yes.
I love it. You see where you're at. I mean, I think you're weighing both ends of the spectrum, and I can get a lot more radical than that. I think the point Bill brings up is perfect, though. Each end is kind of somewhat going to be black and white. In the middle, there's going to be some gray, and where your tummy test flips on that is going to be different for each of you. As well, where your stomach flips on that is different for each person who walks in the door. There are some people who have no objection to raising pigs next door. There's a lot of people that bothers. The substantive due process rule, the first thing to ask yourself is, in my gut, where should this go? Okay? Now, the caveat with that, the flop side, is this. You cannot, in advance, make a decision You cannot in advance take the tummy test and say, okay, this is going to be how it goes, and not listen to anything anybody says. Okay? You can use it as a measure, you can use it as a dipstick. You cannot commit yourself to that and say, no matter what people come up with, that's the route it's got to take. And the reason you can't is because of the other half of due process that's called procedural due process. And that's what we're going to spend most of the rest of this evening talking about. If you go back to the first page of Smith's article, the bottom of this starts out with procedural due process and 9 elements. Don't read the whole thing now. I want to take you through it, then go home and in a fit of pique sometime after a planning board meeting at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're drinking massive quantities of something out of a bottle or whatever you do. Take a read of the thing and remember it. And I sit down, as you can see by this copy, I sit down and flip through this about once a year whether I need to or not, just to kind of get myself back to some semblance of what reality should at least look like, okay? This is a guideline. It's not the rule. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions tonight, and I'm going to try to ask you a bunch of questions tonight regarding how you do business, and some things should come up for you, I hope. Because I don't think any process is perfect. Any way that business is done is exactly right. You can always improve upon it. The first thing that Smith recognizes is a question of notice. That to procedurally do things right, you have to have notice. What's the notice that's required for a rezoning? Now, Zoe, Barb, Catherine? Yeah, what's the notice?
2 weeks in Missouri, first
Okay.
15 years prior to planning board, and then we post.
Okay, 2 weeks in the Missoulian. The first one's published 15 days prior to planning board, right? How many of you read the Missoulian legal publications this morning? 1? I'm impressed. 2, 3, 4, 5? Holy Christmas. Okay, how many of you don't need glasses to read those advertisements? In simple terms, you're the exception. Before you got on this board, did you read them before you got on the board, Bill?
There's a lot of bid stuff that comes out in those.
Bids and stuff like that, so you look at it for business? You look at it for business?
Yes.
You look at it for business?
I just think it's interesting.
Okay. So 4 of you read it for business. How many of your friends read the legal publications every morning?
Very few.
Okay, it's not exactly the thing you get up and do first thing every day. Okay, if it's published in the Missoulian, what it's deemed to be under the laws of Montana and most states is some form of notice. Does it actually give anybody notice?
No.
In reality, does it? Not very often, does it? Who does it give notice to? The people, yeah, just the people who read it. And the people who read it are board members. The people who read it are people who do it for work. Okay? The people, I wouldn't say weird. The people who read it are people who like to rabble-rouse over something. I mean, I can give you a list of 20 names in Missoula County who read it all the time, I'm sure.
But don't you think that if somebody was planning or involved in something, dealing with the planning board, and he knows that this is part of the process, or he thinks that he would strain himself and read it?
Okay, I think that's exactly the point. If you're involved with the board, you're going to read it. If you walk in and you apply for a variance to put a liquor license on your property, okay? It's not like we could call this the Flippers Billiards case or anything. But if you walked in the front door and applied for a permit for a liquor license, are you as the applicant going to look at the notice in the Missoulian? Sure you are. The applicant will. Is the next door neighbor going to look at the notice in the Missoulian?
Well, probably not, but the thing is, the paper adds an article.
Uh-huh. Now, an article's different.
Noticed it.
Right. I agree. I think an article's different. But is the person who lives next door going to actually look at the paper, to look back to the legal publications to see what's going to be rezoned next to me? No.
They'll be directed to it.
They'll be directed to it maybe if there's an article in the Missoulian. Flippers is a bad case in that sense because it's pretty massive. But what about other rezonings? I mean, will most people who live next door find out from the Missoulian?
How about when you put on the telephone pole?
Sure. Now let's go to number 2. I want to do one more thing with the Missoulian. If you happen to be a person who's retired in Missoula, Montana, where do you probably spend your winters? A lot of people, Dr. McCarthy excluded. Yeah, Arizona, California, wherever. Do you go for a month or 2 in the winter sometimes? A lot of people do, though.
I would, my wife can't.
Okay. But when those people go, do you take the Missoulian every day while you're in tropical, sunny Phoenix? Is the odds on bet you do or don't? The odds on bet is you don't. Or you might take the Sunday paper. And those publications come out 7 days a week. So if you're a non-resident person, if you've rented your house out and left, do you actually have notice of what's going on next door from the paper? Probably not. Number 2, post on the premises. A great solution, okay? In theory, it is a wonderful solution because if you post on the premises, what's the assumption you make about the neighbors? They're going to drive by and see it. And where do those postings go up? Come on, where do they put them? I mean, on telephone poles, okay? Never on trees. I don't know why. It's nice, but they always put them on telephone poles. Is that designed to give most people notice? Now that's the other thing, especially after a rainstorm. Yeah, or as you're driving by, try to read it. Yeah, good point. Yeah, they're hard to understand then, but it at least tells you something's going on. And what's on the bottom of the sheet? What does it say? Get hold of. No, don't. Contact Barb, contact Zoe, contact John Turner. Every now and then, I think like twice, I probably shouldn't say this, like twice I've gone out and posted those notices with people from the planning office just to see, what it is that goes on. And they're put up, and invariably, if somebody sees you stop and put it up on the tree, somebody will come over and look. The problem is, while that tells people who live right there the notice, if you happen to be a landlord and live elsewhere, are you going to see it?
Well, you get a certified letter.
We'll get there. That's the last requirement. Okay? If you're a landlord, will you see it? Probably not, number one. Number two, if you're non-resident at that point in time, if you go to Arizona, will you see the posting? Probably not. Now, it used to be you could argue if you're illiterate, will you see it? But I don't think that's a defense in this day and age for a lot of people. But, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 80 years ago, that would have been a problem as well. What Missoula did in response to a nasty situation at Flipper's Billiards, when a rezoning for a liquor license overlay didn't require actual notice, but constructive notice, which is posting and putting it in Missoula. Missoula went to one other requirement, and that's what? Mailing. And who do you mail to?
Well, for subdivision, I mail to adjacent areas, then zoning is, what is it, so 150 feet, including 300 feet.
Okay, so what do those people actually get who are there? They get actual notice. Those people know that something's going on. Now, number one, other people some distance away may be affected, but you've got to draw the line somewhere, okay? And I think that's the reason why it's 150 in the city and 300 in the county, because lots in the county tend to be bigger than in the city. So if you say 300 in the county, well, you'd assume that compensates for the fact that property sizes tend to be bigger. But the purpose is to give you actual notice that something's going on. That's number one. Number two, that notice needs to be adequate and timely regarding the proceedings which are going to occur. If you live in Phoenix, Arizona, if you own the property, and the certified mailing is sent out today, and the planning board meeting is tomorrow night, is the notice adequate and timely? There's no way you can come to the proceeding and appear. Real difficult. So the notice has to be sent sometime in advance. Every now and then you'll have people walk in the front door who say, I didn't get notice of this. And if they didn't live adjacent or within 150 feet or 300 feet, do they actually have notice? Odds on bet is no. How do you handle it? What do you do?
Can you delay the hearing until a later?
Okay, why can't you? Why not do that?
You've got timelines that are different. Although generally there's no.
Okay. There's generally more than one hearing, number one. And number two, is there a problem with delaying the hearing? Is there? Okay, there probably isn't. And there's a couple ways around that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But let's talk about it right now. Generally, what is there for subdivision review now? 60 days?
Well, after it's 60 days by state.
Right, 60 days by state law. Is it possible to waive that with the consent of the applicant?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so if somebody walks into the room and says, I have no notice of this proceeding, I don't know what's going on here, I've got no idea, I got my certified letter yesterday, and I flew in from Mazatlan. Okay? If the applicant is sitting there in the meeting and says to you, or you say to the applicant who's applying for the subdivision or whatever you're doing, look, this person hasn't had notice, we'd like to either one, leave the record open for them to comment, or two, can we delay you 30 more days, is that a problem for you? At that point in time, if the applicant consents, you're home free. If you tell the person who got the letter, gosh, I'm sorry you got it this morning and you're here now, but no, we can't delay it, is that going to be a happy camper?
No.
And are you doing really good things for your PR, for planning, for zoning, for whatever? No way. Okay? So flexibility is possible within the system. Now that's going to be counterbalanced by the fifth thing we're going to talk about, or the fourth thing, which is the fact that people have the right to a prompt proceeding. But I think there's some room for compromise, and usually that compromise can take the place of, okay, for Mr. Jones to make his comments, we'll leave the record open for a week or whatever else. So this public hearing cuts off everyone else but Mr. Jones. You can do that so that he has a chance at that point in time to comment. You're better off to leave the record open for a week for everybody, though, and treat everybody evenly. And you probably have no trouble doing that. Most people don't comment. So there has to be notice, has to be actual, and it has to be timely and adequate And in best case, it's actual, that the person signs a card, certified return receipt that says, I've got it. Okay? I know what adequate notice is most of the time, and I don't know it by rote like Barb and Zoe, et cetera, do, because I don't do enough of them on a daily basis. But I do know enough to know to walk into the proceeding and say, hey, folks, I need a week to comment on this. And if you give that week, you're going to get some comments back, number one, and number two, more important than that, you're going to make a lot of people real happy campers. Okay? That's the other thing. If that person doesn't know to look at you and say, gosh, I need a week to put comments together on this, what sort of ideas do you have for how to handle that? What do you do as a board?
We would make a recommendation.
Okay, is it legitimate to make the recommendation? Sure it is. Okay? I mean, are you at that point in time doing something positive to the person, saying, okay, we understand you haven't had time, we did give notice, it was fair, but we'll leave the record open for 4 or 5 days for everybody. I mean, those are things that are options. Traditionally, they are not done. And that is why traditionally planning boards, zoning boards, boards of adjustment, everywhere, not Missoula, Montana, but nationwide, have a bad reputation. That's why they catch a lot of flack. Okay? So notice has to be the first component. You don't give it, you're done. On its face, if notice is not given, if you don't give the notice and you pass the resolution, guess what happens to the resolution if somebody tries it in court?
Beat.
Yeah, you lose, okay? You can go back and do it again, but on its face, that's the end of it. Secondly, besides notice, an opportunity to be heard has to be provided. What Smith writes is that it's central to the concept of procedural due process that all persons interested in a prospective decision be given an opportunity to offer their views and to supply evidence in their support, okay? That usually means two things: the chance to publicly comment on the project, and the chance, number two, to provide you with some sorts of exhibits. Now, some exhibits you get are really good. I mean, look at the maps that professional engineering companies draw for you, okay? You get some things with overlays that are printed out well, things on the board with maps drawn around it. Look at the exhibits that sometimes the planning office itself or Office of Community Development now gives you. I mean, look at the things Kathy comes up with. But they're good, they're concise, they're well prepared, they're legible, they're readable. It is conceivable, and I've never seen it in Missoula County, I don't think, to end up with a map drawn on a bar napkin, okay? I did a $400,000 real estate deal, some papers for somebody, that started out on a bar napkin a couple weeks ago. I mean, they brought it into my office written on a bar napkin. I kid you not, okay? Did the whole deal through. So it happens. That bar napkin as an exhibit is evidence, okay? And you have to take it. You need to take it. You need to consider what it says, one way or the other way. So if it's the most wonderful map on earth drawn, or if it's a map drawn on a piece of paper and handed to you that's Xerox in freehand, each one should be worth as much, okay? Each one is to be considered. Each one is part of the record. And you have to give persons, all persons, not just the applicant, the opportunity to give you those. If you don't, you've denied procedural due process. You haven't given the opportunity. Now that's got to be fair and equal to everyone, and I guess that's the second thing. That chance doesn't say, well, Mr. Jones, you've had a month, but we'll give you another 2 weeks, but everybody else doesn't get 2 weeks, okay? If somebody walked in and could really prove a hardship, I could maybe see giving that one person an extra week to comment. I think your safest, best bet to give everybody the opportunity to be heard, to give everyone a fair chance. If you're going to extend it for a week for one person or a day for one person, extend it for a week for everyone. Give everybody the same treatment, okay? At that point in time, then everybody's had the same chance to appear. Thirdly, if somebody shows up at the hearing and says, I haven't had a chance to publicly comment verbally now, what's wrong with saying, okay, say what you want to say at this point in time, but we'll hold the record open for a week for you to make written comments? Nothing at all. If they show up at the meeting and that's the case, they came back from Tahiti and posted on the telephone pole in the front of their house at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they see a notice that says at 7 o'clock tonight, there's a planning board meeting. Is it reasonable for you to suggest to them, if they don't make the suggestion first, that we'll hold the record open for you for a week for you and other persons to make comments? You bet it is, okay? And I go so far as to say it's not just their obligation to walk in and ask you for it. I think affirmatively, if you really want to get the comments from the public that are possible, perhaps the board should make the suggestion. It's not me who's going to be asking you for that. It's not Nick Kaufman. It's not Gary Stinsatter. It's that 3 people per month that walk in 36 times a year who don't know up from down in regards to the process. Those are the people you need to target for, because those are the people who have the greatest problem with what you do and how you do it. Jump in at any time, by the way, any of you. Secondly, before we go further, hearing must be open to the public. Okay? I think a chance to hear all of the evidence and a chance to look at all the exhibits is intrinsic within that. So anybody, John Q. Public off the street, me, whoever wants to walk in and get the information, can walk in and get the data from you, can walk in and look at the exhibits in your office and comment on them. Okay? That's really important. It's not just a case that people have the opportunity, but people can review it. And generally that means people can respond to it. People may respond to it, if they so choose.
How do you feel about you hold the record open?
Mm-hmm.
Now, those things are written responses to the planning department. The person that's going to rebut that argument, does he have that chance to rebut publicly then if that record is held open?
Okay, that's a good question. See, it's fairly common to hold the record open for everyone. Generally, I think what happens is people who do written comments know already what the other side's going to say. The safest, best route to say is the record will be open for people in favor of this proposal for 3 days or 5 days. And people who wish to respond to those will have 3 more days after that. Okay? I mean, that's almost getting you to the point of it's like a quasi-judicial proceeding. I don't know if you need to go that far. Okay? But clearly then you've fairly given everybody a chance to respond. The caveat with that is, okay, I want a chance to respond to the response to my response. Okay? So it's like, but I knew that you knew that. I mean, how far do you go with it? I think there's some point in time you need to cut it off. Absent a request, I think you're safe to say everybody gets a week or everybody gets 10 days or whatever. That doesn't mean you need to have another meeting. I mean, I think you look at the record that you get back when you have a public hearing this month, you look at the record before your next meeting a month later. So if the stuff comes in a week later, the packets come out to you a week later and you're set.
In truth, the planning board has recommended motion anyway. Everybody tunes up with planning board, then takes it before the judicial body, the legislative body.
To make the decision.
That has a thing, so they can get through their arguments in front of us. We recommend let them off the hook if they need to be off the hook. And proceed from there.
And it goes from there. As a practical matter, open, public, notorious, and a chance for everybody is what you have to have. I think you need to go the extra mile in giving people the opportunity. Just in terms of diplomacy, it would do so much more. And I think this board's done that a lot. There's a lot of cases in Montana where boards haven't. Three Forks had a really nasty Supreme Court case on it and lost big time over not giving adequate notice. Secondly, Montana has a wonderful open meeting law. I expect for the next 3 years that we will see no more than 4 of you in one room at one time, okay? I'm not saying if it's a cocktail party, some of you have to leave. But there's 10 of you. A quorum's what, 6, 5? Does business? 6? Technically, you can be real nastily accused of violating the open meeting law if any of you are together at one time and talk about anything to do with business at all. Okay? So open means not just open for people to hear. It means you can't go so far as to be together and talk about stuff. If you say you got a 7:30 agenda to start, do you start at 7 o'clock if everybody's here? Okay? If it says 7:30, you start at 7:30. It says 7:07, you start at 7:07. And you don't start before, because that violates people's right to know, people's right to be there. Seems simple. Those are the easy things. You want to get something thrown out in court? Great. Start at 7 o'clock. Okay? When you said 7:30. I promise. I mean, I won't do it, but there's going to be somebody out there who decides they're angry enough about it that they're going to hire a lawyer and they're going to get that decision pitched out. Those are the ones that are black and white. Okay? The hard things to do are to sit down and remember now, just a second, how can I let this person speak? How can I hear what they're going to say? How can I see what they've got to offer and still play within the rules? Those are the hard decisions. And I mean, what I was asked to is kind of talk about the nuts and bolts of how to, but also to talk about the practical reality. And practicality is what keeps you out of trouble. And that's kind of the agenda we're at this point. Thirdly, all right, go ahead. Sure.
Recently, Nick Kaufman did a subdivision in the Rattlesnake, and I live very close by. As a matter of fact, there's only one homeowner between me and the Sunlight Plans. And I I know that I didn't get a notice. I may be 300 feet from the border, but I know people who live across the street from the Sunlight Lands didn't get a notice either. And I knew that when we came into the board meeting for the subdivision. And I had even mentioned it to some planning staff. Now, what is my responsibility when I think that not enough people have been notified?
Can I talk about that in a little while?
Okay.
Okay, good question, but I want to talk about that a little later, when we get to findings of fact. Okay? Remind me if I don't specifically talk about that too. We'll do it. Thirdly, right of cross-examination. I think that right doesn't go specifically to the procedures that you do. And what you'll notice that he writes about the right of cross-examination is it is regarded as adjudicative or quasi-judicial. All parties must be accorded the opportunity to question opponents and opposing witnesses. Usually what you do isn't judicial in nature, okay, or even quasi-judicial in nature. It's usually quasi-legislative or quasi-administrative or administrative or whatever. At the same time, how many times do you go to a hearing or go through a hearing or go through a public hearing that somebody wants to ask a speaker questions? I mean, it happens a lot, doesn't it? I mean, you see it a whole bunch. How do you handle it? What do you do?
If I possibly can, I let them.
Okay, and why do you let them?
Somebody needs to be heard. Somebody's got a reason. Something's got.
Okay, I think that's exactly the rule you should have. I don't think you have to, but I think allowing people to ask questions gives you some real benefit in terms of letting people, one, find out what's going on and why it's going on. Number two, it lets them get the information to do the second thing, to respond to all the information which is there. Now look at the risk there, though. If you let some people ask questions, can you not let some people ask questions?
Difficult. What happens when someone is continually asking, starting to badger the proceeding, whatever you want to call it? You have to call it off sometimes.
Yeah. So how far do you take it? I mean, where do you draw the line? And if you draw the line too close or too far away, or you treat people differently, are you not being unfair to them? I mean, shouldn't everybody have the same set of rules?
Well, Robert's Rules of Order has something to do with this. You can limit discussion to 5 minutes. And it's a very legitimate thing you can do.
Sure.
We have not, to my knowledge, had that kind of problem. People seem
Good.
to be fairly intent on getting their ideas, but not consuming a lot of time or stonewalling.
The fact that you haven't had it is wonderful. At the same time, the fact that you haven't had it should be of great concern to all of you. Because what happens the first time when it comes up? Where do you go with it? I mean, I think part of the reason why we're here, too, is preemptive. How do you solve a problem or prevent a problem from coming up? A rule, a ruling, or something else that says this is how we'll treat questions, will allow them to the point that they become excessive in the eyes of the chair or something. But something that says we're going to handle it, I think, is appropriate.
I try to say limit your response to the issue that was discussed in the previous, rebuttal or whatever it is. That's what.
And that's probably appropriate. I mean, that's the route to take with it. Anyway, the right to cross-examine is probably not absolute in your proceedings, but at the same time, the right to cross-examine is probably necessary, okay? Should be there. And I think by allowing it, you encourage a whole lot of goodwill you don't get otherwise. Fourthly, disclosure. We've talked about it a little bit. There must be an opportunity to see, hear, and know all of the statements and all of the evidence considered by the body making the local decision. The first problem you'll get into are private communications, okay? You want to cause yourself a huge problem, meet somebody at dinner 3 nights before the meeting and go through a map of the project. Something going off in your stomachs right now? Probably for everybody something's going off in your stomachs, yeah. I mean, it just offends your whole sense of fairness that somebody on the board's talking to this developer who then comes in and said, well, Fred, I explained that to you the other night when we had dinner, or when I bought you dinner, if you want to really make it suspect, okay? Or when I had the other 6 members of the planning board to dinner the other night. I mean, you see what happens, okay? And it's a 6-4 vote. You see what the problem is. So there's got to be full disclosure of all information. What happens if you get a private letter addressed to you? What do you do with that letter? First thing. Somebody sends you a letter. Anybody here get a letter? Those of you who've been around a while? None of you ever have, eh? That surprises me. If you get a letter addressed to you as a member of the planning board on a certain project, what's the first thing you should do with it?
Take it down to the planning office.
All right. Let's dump it on the planning office. Okay, planning office, it's just been dumped on you. What's the first thing you do with it? You too, Kathy. So.
Part of the record.
Sure, and how do you make it part of the record?
You would write it up in your report.
Okay, one, you write it up in the report.
Right, have it as an attachment.
That's the best thing. Put it as an attachment. What's the third thing you probably do?
Could read it into the record as
Or send a copy to
all the.
everybody else on the board.
Oh, right,
So
yeah.
they consider it too.
They would get the
They get the report. Okay, great. So you're set. So at that point in time, I think you've solved the problem. I mean, there was disclosure then of the information that came to you or you or you or you by giving it to everybody else who's on the board. And any other person who wants to see the report, any member of the public gets to see the letter, etc. The case that happens all the time, I have not yet seen one where it didn't happen, are water rights proceedings in Montana. You want to do an administrative nightmare? I mean, you guys do a lot of wonderful work. I assure you that nothing is hotter in the state than water rights, okay? You can run off with somebody's wife, you can shoot their horses, it doesn't matter. But if you touch their water, okay, it is bad news. So what all the time do the neighbors do? Well, this guy's taking my water, so who am I going to write a letter to about what a terrible, awful, nasty person they are? We're going to write the letter to the hearings officer. Oh my gosh, the hearings officer. So what's the first thing he has to do? He's got to copy it and send a copy of the letter to all the persons who are party of the proceeding. You know how many objectors there are on the Crook Fork River? Okay? You see the problem. Big time, but it's an ex parte communication. That's what it's called, the official term. It's other information, and everybody needs to have access to that information, and that's how you get it. Fasano versus Board of County Commissioners of Washington is talked about on page 164. And he talks about it in terms of disclosure. I talk about it in terms of item number 10, but I'm going to put it where he puts it so when you go back and read this stuff, you can keep it straight. The Fasano decision is cited probably more than any other zoning and planning case now except for Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company. What the Fasano decision says is that in regards to disclosure and the way the proceeding goes, there must not only be just disclosure that indicates there was a fair process. The process that we went through to get to the result has to appear to be fair. Okay? It doesn't matter if the process was fair or not. The process has to be so clean that on its face it appears to be fair. Okay? So you can have the best procedure on earth, and if it even looks tainted, it doesn't matter if it is clean or not. If it looks tainted, the court's going to say you violated due process. Thank you very much. Go back to go. Do not collect $200. Okay? Fasano's big law, and I think Fasano goes to your question, and it's going to go to about 10 other questions I'm going to ask you when we get further through the rest of this. What is appearance of fairness? And I think appearance of fairness best comes out when we talk about item number 6, what's a conflict of interest? But in regards to notice, in regards to communications, in regards to information, appearance of fairness has to be part of the proceeding. The other place that appearance of fairness, I think, rears its ugliest head. How many of you have special knowledge about certain aspects of Missoula County? Title examiner? Architect? How long have you lived here, Dr. McCarthy?
All my life.
Okay. Okay.
Education years.
Okay.
World War II.
Bill, you know a lot about Missoula County, and you've plumbed a third of the buildings in it or whatever else one way or the other. Forest Service, what do you know special about? Airport controller? Barb Martins, how long have you worked for the office? But you're not on the board.
13 years.
Okay. How many of you know, I know Cipolatos have been here a long time, okay, an institution. How many of you know something special about Missoula that are on the board? So when somebody walks in and says a whole bunch of stuff, at what point in time do you stand up and say, you know, that pasture is right next to my house up the Rattlesnake, and there's these 28 things about that pasture that are unique, and it's going to cause a major flood if you build a road across that at that point in time, when nobody else in the proceeding has a clue that that's going to happen but you. 1948, the river flooded that field. How many times have I heard that one? Okay? Or what used to be there was, I'm guilty of saying that a lot, and I'm not that old. You see what I'm saying? I think appearance of fairness rears its worst head in regards to the question you asked earlier, which is what do I say as a member of the board about what I know, about what the process looks like, about what I know. I want to talk about that in a while. Appearance of fairness is real important for two reasons. With the other 10 of you, or with the other 9 of you, does what one of you say have a lot of sway, so to speak? Do you give yourselves a lot of credibility? You bet you do. And if you don't now, will you in a year? Were you more so in 2 years? Were you more so in 5 years? And when somebody walks in the door who doesn't know that David, Bill, Pat, Troy, Ivan, Kate, and Helen have known each other for 10 years and are calling each other David, Bill, Pat, Troy, Ivan, Kate, Helen, and let's really make it bad. Let's say that Nick's on the other side promoting the project and Wally just walked into the back of the room, whose name you know as well. When you guys are saying, Nick, what about that project, and somebody's talking against it, to that person sitting out there, does that process appear to be fair? And when you read the transcript, and the transcript said, well, Pat asked Nick, need I go further? Or Pat said into the record in response to Nick's question, and who then argues for the project is Pat on the board. And you see the problem? I want to talk about it, but your minds ought to be rolling really fast at this point in time. Because the mess you get yourself in, and it only happens once in a planning board's lifetime. Because once it happens, the county gets sued, and then they take a big knife and they got a planning board out, and they give you the authority to do nothing for about 15 years, or nobody plans. Hard questions. Fifthly, I'll get back to that. Think about it through the rest of the proceeding here. Findings of fact. I was asked in detail to discuss findings of fact with you, largely because traditionally this board, the Board of Adjustment, etc., have a lot of problem and a lot of discomfort with the findings of fact question. I think all of you know, or all of you should know at this point in time, that when you do some activity, you need to have reasons. Generally, and I've given you a copy of one, what you get in regards to reasons is a report like this. This one is for the Missoula Consolidated Planning Board. I apologize for the date, and if some of you don't have it, I'll be happy to provide you with one, if anybody else doesn't. Now, I had to go back to 1986 to find one of these where John Torm is out of the city right now, and he's a very good friend of mine, so I can give him a ration about this. And Chris Rocky's gone, because everybody else that I have these for is still on the staff, so I had to flip back through files to find one. What you have is a staff report. I have some real basic problems with it, and every now and then I go around with the county attorney's office and with planners about it. In my measure, I guess in my gut feeling, I think this business about recommended motion shouldn't be there. Okay?
Presupposes the outcome.
Right. Well, I don't think one presupposes the outcome. To me, what's the purpose of the planning office?
State the facts.
Okay, to state the facts. Is the purpose of the planning office to come to the conclusion?
That's their major function.
I love it. That's their major function. Is the purpose of the planning staff to come to the conclusion?
No.
No. Are they appointed by the county commissioners to sit and represent a cross-section of the county of Missoula to make decisions about a long-range plan? So why is it that this planning board, that this county, that this city requires them to give you a recommended motion? Okay? On its face, if you walk in the door over there, when you walk in that door and you're John Q. Public, you're not me and you're not Nick, but when you walk in that door, I mean, I know everybody in that office. Half of them I went to school with. Okay, that's unfair. And the other half of them I've worked with, except for yourself, Catherine, but give yourself a couple of years. I'm not planning on going anywhere if you're not. Okay, when I walk in the door over there and I'm Wally Congdon, do I know what they're going to want? And if I don't know what they want in advance, how many times a week do I call you, Barb? It's too many, but how many is it? You can say, it's too many. 2, 3? Probably twice a week. Zoe, how many times? How many times does Nick Kaufman call you every week? 10, 5, 3. Andy Fisher?
4 or 5.
Stinsatter Drivestein.
4 or 5.
Okay? Am I making the point? When those people walk in the office, they're going to talk to her, they're going to go through it. When John Q. Public walks in the office to ask Barb Martins how to do a subdivision, or to ask Zoe Moheski, how do I go about getting a variance for this? Do they walk in the office knowing that based on what they tell her and what they say to her, she's going to make a recommendation to you? They have no clue. When they walk in the door, what do they expect that person to do?
Give them information.
Right, which means they're a what? What's it called? 2 words. Starts with a P. Public servant, right. Source of information, public servant, whatever. Okay? So when they walk in the door, the first thing they say is, I want to rezone my land agricultural because I want to raise pigs. Do they know that she's going to write down something that says this should be denied because there will be a substantial impact on the olfactory senses of the entire neighborhood? No way they know in advance, okay? The point is real simple. Those people are there to be a public servant, number one. The reason they give you a recommended motion, the reason they do it across the country, and I think it's wrong, that's my own personal opinion, the reason they give you one is because planning boards have historically been abysmal at coming up with them. It's like recommended motions. That's like findings of fact. Why? You people cumulatively know more about the city of Missoula than probably any other 10 people in town. And if you didn't, you wouldn't be on this board. Look who's here. I mean, look at yourselves. Okay, whether you're alternate, whether you sit on the board, you know what's going on. You know what the city is. You know where it's been. If you've been here all your life, a lot of you know where it's going. You've probably read the airport master plan lately. Okay? Kate, you know who buys and sells whatever because it goes to your title plan on a whatever basis. Okay? I know that Cipollatos have watched Missoula grow up from being the Broadway market on the corner to being the Broadway market still on the corner, surrounded by gas stations that say Exxon. Be that as it may, who should make the recommended motion or who should come up with a motion is probably not the planning staff. Are they there to make a decision, to cant things one way or the other way? They're there to provide you with what? Information, data, etc. That's their purpose, that's their goal, okay? Secondly, when they write you proposed findings of fact, if they have to have a conclusion, what does it automatically mean the findings of fact are going to back up? Yeah. Do you think they go through the findings of fact first and then go back and say, okay, now this is the conclusion we're going to come to from those facts? I tell you to shut that camera off for a minute and very candidly talk with these people, but I can't do this. I have a contract. What I tell you from my experience is that in talking to people who work in planning offices, and I will let all of them remain nameless, what I will tell you is that the impression in planning offices across Montana is that if it's for a variance or something that breaks the rules, their understanding of the law is they have to say no. So what you get is a soft denial. If they think it's a good idea but a good project but we can't go otherwise, what we get is it's going to be a no, which means that we can arrange the facts so that the facts point to it kind of should be denied, okay? And this is a frank conversation, and I hope it never comes back to haunt anybody. It won't come back to haunt me. Be that as it may, it means the denial is soft, but it's still a denial. Okay? So to me, the people who should write the recommended motions and the people who should put the facts together or adopt or not adopt the facts that were objectively gathered by the staff that you hire and I, as an applicant, hire, because I paid a percentage of what they made too with the taxes from my land. The people who should put those together to come up with a result are you, not them. I think all of them would tell you they are uncomfortable with that. If you want to...
Why do they have to say no? What is the philosophy behind that?
I don't know. I've always wondered. I think the philosophy is paranoia over spot zoning. I think the philosophy, it is. It's paranoia over spot zoning. It's paranoia over treating people differently. I have seen this planning board, and almost none of you are on it. I've seen the Board of Adjustment in this town do things to its employees that I find heinous. I mean, I would burn people at the stake before I've done things that I've seen this board do. Okay? I mean, I can think of people walking out humiliated. It's like, why are you coming to us with this recommendation? Well, the reason I'm coming to you with this recommendation is because I looked at the facts, and this is what they say in my estimation. And if you don't like the way I interpret them, then why do you require me to write a report that says this is the recommended motion? Okay? Go back and look at your minutes if you don't believe me.
This saves a lot of time. Everybody is not a teacher, an airplane
You're right.
operator,
Mhm.
et cetera, et cetera. Some people don't put these kind of quasi or not so quasi legal things together in their head nearly as well as others.
Mhm.
And we have enough trouble changing a word in
You're right.
this thing,
But now,
let alone putting the whole thing together.
now you've got the perfect question, though.
So
What are we here to do? Are we here to save time?
no, but if we don't waste it.
Right, we're here to not waste it. So is the solution to say, make those people bring you the decision and then go from there with it? Or is the solution to say, let's learn how to write findings of fact and let's learn how to write motions? I think that's the solution, and that's what we're trying to do tonight.
By the way, many of these get changed.
Oh, and most of them get changed. A lot of them get changed. And I think that illustrates the point. You know in your guts what's right and what's wrong and what the facts justify. The question, I mean, these are not bad guys. Regardless of the Missoulian, John Torma, Pat Kiley, Barb Martins, Zoe Maheski, you haven't been here long enough to wait this. They are not known communists.
I think, though, you have to recognize that for each individual, 10 people to come into the planning staff and say, I want the facts on this case or whatever you're looking at, they're going to get different facts also. So I think what you have to start out with is common set of facts, and how are you gonna get there?
That's fine. I think the common facts are what you want to start out with. What I'm saying is if you have a common set of facts, why is it you have to go the next step to recommended motion?
No, that's
Okay.
wrong. I think, I agree with you.
See, I agree with what you're saying too, that you need the facts at least someplace to start, and you've got that, okay?
The trouble with that is that the staff can, they can bring up the facts and they can bring up the facts.
Oh, are you suggesting that we can bring up the conclusion and we can bring up the conclusion? I mean, it's the same difference. You're right.
I mean, and so this is a matter of integrity and, I guess competence, and maybe you should have on the staff people that differ in their feelings about things.
Catherine?
In the last agency that I worked for, and I worked for 13 years, we would write several different resolutions. We would write for something, against something, with conditions, and so on and so forth. I've never seen only one motion that's proposed to a board. But it does help to have something written out that people can look at, change words. That's a very helpful kind of thing than listening to different people and trying to get a secretary to write things down and repeat things back. It's just a helpful device.
Maybe there's three things that ought to be there. The first should read, and take a look at the one you've got. After reviewing the testimony, the board recommends that the property described not be rezoned from D residential to B industrial. And the third one should read, after reading all the testimony and documentation, the board recommends that the property should be, and leave the rest of it blank. Then you've got three options before you. So there isn't a recommended motion. There's optional motions presented, but there's not a recommended one.
I was on the Board of Adjustments, and they gave you the facts and the recommendation, but we just flat out said, we crossed out the recommendation. But you're still biased. That's what the experts are saying, yes or no, and you're biased, but at least it starts with an open argument for discussion.
But I think it's important to provide a recommendation, because basically what is a recommendation? It's an opinion, it's staff's opinion. So we could go through this whole report and not come to any conclusion and just leave it wide open. And I don't think the board would be real comfortable, or any board would be comfortable with that. It's an opinion. Maybe it's not worded real good, because it's staff's motion, it's not the board's motion. So
Take
maybe
care of
it should
yourself.
say It's staff's recommended motion to do whatever, instead of the board's motion, because the board didn't have anything to do with it at this time.
Well, maybe the thing to do is to have three motions at the beginning and then put another category on the end that says staff suggestion, staff recommendation. Call it whatever you want to call it. Staff comments, to me, kind of does that. Anyway, the first problem I've got, when you talk about findings of facts and reasons, to me, when you walk in and what you've got is a recommended motion, it's all over. I can read that recommended motion. I'm sure all of you can read that recommended motion. And you can tell me, or you can tell each other, what the rest of that set of facts is going to say and how they're going to read. I think there's no question.
I have a philosophical problem with findings of fact. We go through testimony and we read staff comments and recommended motions. If we don't agree with what the staff recommends, we are expected to change the findings of fact. And that leaves me a little queasy, because we're changing facts.
Why? You're
No,
not changing
we're
facts.
changing opinions. It's the staff's opinion that it provides for adequate light and air. And just calling them findings of fact is rather irksome.
Okay, I want to talk about this relative to that. I think the first thing is, do you want to have a staff recommendation, a recommended motion that's cut and dried, yes or no, at the beginning? I don't think you do. To me, one makes you suspect. It appears unfair. Okay? I agree with a lot of people use that street. This property's right there. How's this neighborhood zoned back here? Okay? How was it originally zoned? This staff report tells you it was originally zoned in the 1930s. In fact, it was zoned in 1932, a very good year for zoning, 6 years after Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company, which is when all of America got zoned. They zoned all this land out here, some category called I-1. That's what it was originally, and what's I-1 stand for? Right, only in those days it stood for heavy industry, because what was right here was what? I wish Dr. McCarthy hadn't left. How many people were... What was there?
The streetcar shop.
No, what was there? Montana Power Company and AT&T are there now. What was there before? What was that? Come on. Sawmill, exactly. There was a lumber company right here, okay? And what did those people at the lumber company, like every other little town in western Montana, what did they get every night on their way home from work to go home with? Not beer, come on. Jeez, can tell you run a market. Come on, what did they get every night?
Firewood.
Yeah, but was it all firewood they took home? In theory it was firewood, but what was it really? Go to Milltown, Montana. Go to over around White Pine Sash Company. Go to this neighborhood. Go to where Hamilton Brothers used to be lumber company. What did people carry home every night? It was, quote, firewood, but what did they do with it? They built their houses with it. A ton of them built their houses with it. And if you go to that neighborhood out here, this is zoned I-1 for what? Heavy industry. Because what was right here? A huge lumber company. Okay? What's built out here? Yeah, and how big are most of the old residential houses that are there? 900? Come on, you're an optimist.
600.
Does the size of this room mean anything to you? Yeah, and there's a whole, drive out through the neighborhood, drive out, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th streets, all those little streets out there. People built little tiny houses on wood foundations, okay? It was an old kind of mill-type neighborhood, whatever you want to call it. People built nice little homes, kept them up, but they were tiny. Zoning came along to the 60s, and what happened? This stayed zoned industrial. Now, why did that stay industrial? What goes down here twice a day? Trains. What did this street become? It became a major busy street because what did 14th Street eventually do? Went all the way through to Reserve, okay? What went in right here at the corner of Mount and Russell? Convenience store, a gas station, Montana Power Company, AT&T, and that wonder of the 20th century that lets you go through intersections rapidly, a stoplight. So everybody and their brother goes by there. If you have a house, well, how did this get built up along this area right here? What happened here? What got built there? Was it industry? What got built there? Little houses, okay? So they're sitting in an I-1 zone. If you look out their front window, what do you see? Trains. You see the back of the Columbia Paint Building. It's scenic and beautiful and wonderful. It is. It's that color right there on the wall. And it's 1.5 stories tall, and it's a city block long. And what's between the Columbia Paint Building and the railroad track? Come on, you guys. Junk and? Come on, it's about this tall. Gross weeds, knapweed, beautiful stuff. And then there's a railroad track, and then what's next between the railroad track and the street? Knapweed again. It's tropical. And a telephone line. Got to have power poles. Okay, otherwise it's not Montana. Then what do you have? You have a major street, and then what do you have? Houses. Okay? And this is the kind of thing we want to zone B1 for single-family dwellings down the road or for multiple family dwellings. We want people to live there. Now, go a step further. This report doesn't say any of this. Go back out in this neighborhood and what's happened due to zoning in the last 15 years. Drive out there if you haven't driven out there. What's out there now? And more than trailer houses. What's it zoned for? Duplexes and? Right. And Kate knows that because she works for a title company and buys and sells them all the time they go through her office. Yeah. And duplexes and fourplexes are there. And those duplexes and fourplexes in that neighborhood have done what? Is there room to park? Is there room to store stuff? Is there room to do anything? Not a lot at all, because those are little tiny 25-foot lots, but most of them were doubled and people have them. So what happened in the neighborhood? Everybody built duplexes and fourplexes. People have no place to store a thing. These people right here on the edge of this, we're going to zone for permanent residential dwellings. And what do they get to look at for the rest of their born days? The wall from Columbia Paint Company. It's beautiful. What did the owner want to do with the property? And written in the upper right-hand corner in Wally's nasty printed handwriting is what word? What two words? Storage sites. Industrial zoning in Missoula County allows you to do what? Build storage buildings. And what did the person want to put in that location? Storage buildings. Was he willing to landscape it? Yes. Was he willing to make it look pretty? Yes. And does it provide something the neighborhood needs? Yes. And if you zone it residential, can you put them there? No. Which means what? All the people who live there in fourplexes with no storage get to drive all the way out of Missoula along Russell or Reserve Street or 14th Street to get to storage sites. So they can store the stuff they have no room to put in their apartments. Okay? Plus, do you want to have a buffer zone of storage buildings between that wonderful railroad track and that wonderful knapweed and that wonderful building and residential houses, or do you want to build residential houses right to the edge? Okay? That's the presentation that went to the planning board. Were you on the board then, 86? Okay. That may, because it may have been, yeah, it may have been, that was quite a while ago.
No, this was Missoula College.
86 though, yeah, it was consolidated then. Yeah, okay. That was the presentation that went to the planning board. What you just heard is, in a nutshell, 20 minutes of presentation to the board. That's what happened. That's the history of it. I did the presentation. I talked to a bunch of people and said, wait a second, look what you're doing long term. The planning board denied this rezoning and said, we disagree that it should be rezoned. The planning board did not adopt new findings of fact. And here's how easy I think it was, and I didn't do this in, and I wish I would have. I think in answer to your question, the findings of fact could have been as follows. One, that the neighborhood around this site has developed with increased density during the past number of years. It has. There's fourplexes and duplexes all over it. Two, that adjacent uses to this property are not compatible with residential development. Those uses include, one, an arterial street, two, a railroad track, three, major industrial buildings or commercial buildings, the backside of which is exposed to this property. And three, that a need for some sort of other industrial type services is necessary in the neighborhood, comma, those building storage facilities, mini warehouses, etc., which could be developed at a later time. For the preceding reasons, the rezoning recommendation is denied. Okay? Was there any opinion in it? There's a judgment call which says, well, we think something should be there, and there's a judgment call which says we want a phased-in zone from residences to this nasty railroad track through the middle of Missoula. But at that point in time, do you, in a fairly simple, easy nutshell, have findings of fact that justify your conclusion?
So don't you have to answer the findings, or answer the questions, the 12 questions?
And I think those three things answer part of them. When you have
You
the...
don't have to answer all 12 of them?
No, that's the next thing I want to talk about. In regards to the 12 questions, what you're presented with are 12 issues regarding zoning. And those 12 issues say, well, we have to consider these. Any one of those, if it's substantial enough, is reason enough to overthrow the decision. Case in point, and it's not to do with zoning, but I think it's a good sample. And I talked to Barbara Evans about this today, because I told her I was going to use her name tonight. Is anybody familiar with the Evans Crossing? What the Evans Railroad Crossing, what that is? Okay, the Evans Crossing is out between the Reserve Street Bridge and the Scott Street overpass. It's about halfway between. If you turn at Quality Supply and go straight, you go towards the old Van Evans plywood plant. Instead, you go into LP, turn left, and go to Stockyards, okay? The Evans Crossing is up for closure right now. And the reason it's up for closure is because trucks carrying nasty chemicals to 3 chemical companies back there, a liquid oxygen plant, and to the Evans Products plant, as well as all the fuel trucks that haul gasoline to most of Missoula across that railroad track. And guess what else happens to be traveling on the railroad track at the same time? All the same nasty chemicals, or the nasty chemicals that combine with those chemicals to make really nasty stuff, okay? So it's a potential major disaster. And in fact, there's a report from Safety Services in Missoula County saying that's a potential disaster. County commissioners have a hearing a couple of weeks ago. Go through the whole hearings process. They go through 2 hours of public testimony. At the end of the testimony, Barbara Evans says, I just need to say to you that at this point in time, I'm going to vote against or in favor of closing this, because given this report which says that if a railroad car full of X comes in contact with a truckload of Y and breaks itself open on that railroad track, you're going to have a major industrial disaster in Missoula County, Montana. By the way, how many million gallons of gasoline are stored right there as well? All the tanks are there, you know? Great place for an explosion. That if that happens, the risk is so great that it's not worth having that railroad crossing open. It's one issue, public safety. That crossing's been there since before the railroad came in 1883. Okay? Is that one issue enough to justify closing it? In her mind, yes. In a lot of other people's minds, yes, too. Because the risk is so substantial that that one thing on public health trumps everything else. Closing that costs a lot of people a lot more money. It wastes a whole lot of time. I ran the numbers on it, and I can tell you what they are. It's like $5,000 a week or something that closing that crossing will cost people. I can't remember. It's 390 man-hours a week of time that going over the Reserve Street Bridge will cost people. Blow up one train load full of stuff. Is it worth the risk? So it's one issue. So I don't think you need to, on every issue, pitch out the staff report. That's number one. Number two, if the staff report doesn't give you a recommendation, will those facts be written more, quote, objectively, or with less orientation towards a certain result? I think so. And I think you'll find them a lot more adoptable at that point in time. Thirdly, beware of what in the business is called the apple-orange gambit. I've naturally lost my copy now. look to item number 11. It's about page 4. The question asked is whether the zoning was adopted with a view towards conserving the value of the buildings. The building on the property subject to this rezoning is a non-conforming residential structure. Should the structure be destroyed more than 50% of replacement value, it could not be rebuilt. Changing the applicable zoning of this property to be residential would remove this restriction and consequently improve the value of the existing building. What's wrong with the finding of fact? Read it a couple times to yourself.
It's non-conforming.
Okay, how does it, but what, the finding, the use there, is the use there now conforming?
It's grandfathered.
Okay, but look at the finding relative to the criteria. I hate to pick on the Forest Service, but the Forest Service is the best at doing this of anybody I've ever seen. That's where the term the apple-orange gambit came from, to me at least. What you have is apples. Whether the zoning was adopted, not the zoning we're going to go to, but is the zoning that was adopted with a view towards the value of the buildings? It wasn't at that point in time. But we're looking backwards to say, why was something done before? Now look at the criterion set forth in the finding, the last sentence. Changing the applicable zoning, all of a sudden you're looking ahead. The benefit comes from changing it to protect that. But is that the criteria? Does it say in number 11, does the proposed zoning benefit the buildings in the site? It doesn't say, does the proposed zoning give a benefit? It says, does the zoning which is there, was the zoning which is there, was that zoning adopted to preserve something? So you're looking backwards with the criteria, but the factual analysis looking down the road, saying there's a benefit from.
Well, I'm not sure if that phrase hasn't been changed, because
The phrase has been.
Okay,
It's different now.
because I've just worked with that phrase, and
It is different now.
Yeah.
Right. What I wanted, the reason I'm using it is to try to say, look, this is what happens. It's apples versus oranges. Okay? Where you see it in a lot of things is they say a criteria is X, Y, Z. The benefit comes from MQP. If you've got X, Y, Z, you've got to have X, Y, Z. So when you come up with findings, you need to say, look, if the subject is whether the zoning is compatible with the comp plan, it is or it isn't. Okay? That's the question. Not is something in 5 years going to comply? Does the existing zoning comply? The question is, does the zoning proposed comply with the comp plan or not? It's that simple. Don't mix apples, i.e. do we comply with the comp plan with existing stuff, with oranges. Does the future zoning comply with the comp plan? Okay? In regards to findings then, I think if you sit and listen, I think if you kind of decide why you're making the decision the way you are, and put it in 2 or 3 brief sentences, you can, on its face, make findings of facts which should be adopted by you. Okay? I agree that there's a judgment call on those. I think at some point in time people see things a different way. This one may be too easy. Okay? And the only reason that one gets easy is because somebody happened to know the history of the neighborhood. Otherwise, it wouldn't be easy. It isn't easy at that point in time. I think a lot more people ought to start asking those questions. Not just where are we going, which is does it comply with the comp plan, but where have we been? That makes the findings easier.
Just about like that one I brought up earlier about the rezoning of the industrial and resident, or commercial. Troy, after the thing passed, and Troy kind of jumped in and said, well, where's your findings of fact? Well, it's tough to do with the way it's set up now. Drug discount, Barb and Zolan, I wish Mike was here to try to deal with it. This makes it real tough for us. Yeah, these make a lot of sense, you guys. Now we gotta just throw that away and build new ones, because these are pretty biased one way. And it's like, well, I'm not gonna disagree with this thing, so I gotta go through and make all the finding of fact. And I do that. I don't wanna have to go through that hassle. It'd be a lot easier, and it'd be something that I would think would be a lot easier if we all had just findings of fact and not comments or opinions in here, or biased one side or the other. Then it would be simple.
It would be easier. It won't be simple. Don't deceive yourself, Bill. It's easier. I agree. I mean, it's an interesting comment. I don't mean to cause stress in-house. But I think what you're hearing is that this format doesn't lend itself to changing. And that may be because this format calls for you guys to make a conclusion.
Why can't we just just have a list of these, and after we've had the public hearing, we write the answers. Why do we got the answers in front of us to begin with?
You may want to try it.
That saved weeks.
And we
Kate?
can just write 1 or 2 sentences.
Can't you do it when you do your findings and facts, give both sides of the story? You read opinions, you say, well, I did it this way or that way.
Yeah.
There are some things now in the findings of fact that you really can't give two opinions. It's either in conformance with the comprehensive plan or it is not. You know, so it's
Well,
not
some of
a
those,
yes or no.
right, but then sometimes when you give your comments or what have you, and it seems to sway towards the side that you have recommended, where's the comments that sway towards the guy who says, I don't want this to happen?
Let me ask you this.
I think that's the board rule, that's the rule, you look at this, you look at the findings of fact and say, hey, do I agree with these things? And instead of throwing those out, or throwing a recommended motion out, just to stop and say, hey, do I agree with this or not, and why do I? Not let this completely overtake all of your decision making.
Let me ask you this. Are these criteria a request for a finding of fact, or are these requests for criteria, or are these requests in here, are they something that ask for a conclusion about the facts? Take a read of them. Whether the zoning is compatible with the comprehensive plan. I think that's a finding of fact, yes or no?
Yes or no?
Finding of fact is comprehensive plan at this site provides for XYZ, this zoning is XYZ. Okay? Whether the zoning will lessen congestion in the streets. Is that a conclusion? Probably so. What's the fact? 1, this site will generate 285 car turns a day at this location. 2, the arterial things which lead to this site are 14th Street, Russell Street, and Mount Avenue, where it comes from. 3, a traffic light at this site has a traffic count of XYZ cars per day. 4, this proposed use generates XYZ number of more cars through that. Staff conclusion may be, we feel, based on this evidence, staff feels that there will be increased congestion at the site. Okay?
That's all you want said, too.
That may be all you want said, but then you've got the facts about how you're getting to the conclusion. I think these are the right criterion. I mean, the law seems to say they're the right criterion. Who am I to question them? I think they're making the quantum leap you just talked about, Pat, though. They're not asking you to give me the facts. They're asking you to say, put the facts in and take me one step further, give me the conclusion. And I think that's your job. And I think what you say is true, Bill. If you're given those facts like so, you can change the conclusion really easily to say, no, we know there's 270 more turns per day, but we don't feel that's going to cause more congestion.
Yeah, that might also improve the situation where, we'll sit down and you read through these, and in some sort of way they form sort of a consistent picture. And then somebody stands up and tells a better story. Pretty good stuff. All of a sudden it goes from this to this, and then you've got this package, and it's hard to know where to change it. Whereas the more that it's facts, then it's easy to make those incremental adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
Right, you've got 4 pages here you'd have to change.
Yeah, look at number 3, whether the zoning will secure safety from fire and other dangers. Statement of fact or a request for a conclusion. I mean, granted, it's a conclusion you have to make. That factual conclusion is what leads you to the result. But I think you want the facts that lead to it, not the conclusion itself. Whether the zoning promotes the health and general welfare. Is that a factual question? Those are not factual. I mean, there's facts that lead to it. Is it going to have garbage? Is it going to have odor? Is it going to have waste? Is it going to have sewage? I mean, the list goes on. Will it generate bacteria? Will it provide an open dump space? Will it contaminate groundwater? Do I need to keep going? But does any one of those itself make the conclusion that it promotes public health and general welfare?
Well, public health and welfare in zoning law has even gotten into areas of aesthetics. So
great,
we're not
isn't it?
only talking about bacteria and sewage and things like that that we can count and we can measure, but things like aesthetics as well.
Are you suggesting, Catherine, that the concept of pretty is not a completely objective criterion? That's the point, exactly. I mean, what you're saying is true. You're making your judgment, and Barb makes her judgment, Pat makes his judgment, Kathy's going to make hers, Zoe's going to make hers. And how many of you vote on the planning board? 10? So how many other judgments are made? The fact you need is it's going to have XYZ pounds of garbage, it's going to make XYZ odor, it's going to do these things. The decision about number 4 shouldn't be, I don't think, in a lot of ways, the staff's decision. I think a recommendation's appropriate about a conclusion, but the conclusion comes from this board.
I think an important fact per se is that each one person on the board probably should go out and actually visually look at the place, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And of course, if you're talking about 150 acres, that's something else, but, if you're looking at something, well, just like this,
Mhm.
somebody, people went out there and looked at it, and then they'd have some idea of what's on the paper.
You have a concept of what it is. I think as well your comment is appropriate. And let's talk a little bit about that for the moment now. When I said what's on that site before, how many people in this room knew there was a lumber mill there historically, except for yourself? Okay? You're on the planning board. Do you have an obligation to say historically that was a lumber mill? Is it appropriate to? You bet. Okay?
Oh, we're discussing.
Now, that's a fact. Okay? There's no doubt about it. How many people in this room know where the old dumps in Missoula were? How many people know how many old dumps were in Missoula? That's the first question. How many people?
Dump at the airport.
There was one.
There's one on the river.
There's one on the river. Where else was there one? There's at least 4 that are vacant now, that are buried. How many people know where the coal mines in Missoula used to be? There's 3 of them. Okay? If somebody knows, is that a fact? You bet it is. Okay?
But
There's no
why-
question.
If it has no bearing whatsoever on this thing that we're discussing right now, so to speak, it's extraneous, why bother with it?
But see, it isn't extraneous. And what's not extraneous about it, if you know that neighborhood has traditionally single-family dwellings, and that neighborhood traditionally was large lots with single-family dwellings, most lots were 100 feet wide, and you know in the last 20 years it's changed to be almost all duplexes and fourplexes infilled around that. Is that a fact that if nobody brings it up, it affects the decision? You bet it is. Is it something you ought to mention to the board? Tough question.
Is that the same as my question?
You
about
bet it's the same as your question. If you know the neighbors don't have notice, and you're on the board, do you sit down and say, you know, I live right there and none of these people know about this. I know it might be a difficult problem for the developer, but adequate notice probably has not been given, and we feel that we owe it to these other persons to do that. Developer, can you wait 2 weeks? One, how many developers are going to sit down and say, no, we won't wait? You want some bad PR? Try that one on for size one time. I mean, there's times you have to do it when you're a developer and you've got bank, Kate, you know the story. Listen, I need this yesterday at 2 o'clock. I'll bring in the stuff to finish it tomorrow morning and I'll pay you for it next year. Okay? I mean, you've all heard it. Sometimes time matters a great deal, but normally it can wait. Regards to findings of fact then, I think what you're seeing is traditionally what you've gotten. 1 has conclusions built in it, and 2, the things that are asked for, the very way this is written, ask the staff to jump to a conclusion. I think what you're having trouble with, Bill, what all of you have trouble with traditionally, is not coming up with new findings of fact. I think what you're having trouble with is saying in your mind, now wait a second, there's X, Y, and Z that lead me to this conclusion, but X, Y, and Z aren't in the report. What's in the report is some of X, Y, and Z, and the conclusion stated. You want to make the conclusion.
And I think the board members should, Ginny's good at it, ask the staff how they came to that conclusion, how that finding of fact was arrived at in the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And that clears out a lot of problems sometimes.
This format, these conclusions that are findings of fact, you need to use. Okay? I mean, those are the criteria that are relative. I think actually making that conclusion or the facts that lead to them with less discussion is probably a lot more appropriate and a lot more important for you. Let me ask you this. Are you as paranoid about findings of facts now as you were earlier tonight or as you were 6 months ago? Do you have some better handle on it?
I got another question.
Shoot. Ask away. Because I don't know what to tell you.
There's
I mean,
certain things, like, say this last one, I keep going back to this one, but it sticks out my mind. I think it's Troy jumped over it, but, Troy's good, he's smooth as talk, but I wasn't that no. Says whether the zoning is compatible with comprehensive plan. It was not.
okay.
No act that argued that, but it didn't make sense. Is there a problem with, like, does the majority of these findings of these 12 factors have to be, or can it just be 1 or 2? I know just what you said earlier about Barbara Evans is a
One's adequate.
glaring one, but,
Yeah. One's adequate.
okay, so I don't have to, I can disagree with 11, but that one's more important, and that's the one I'm
It can be if it is to you. Now, what's interesting is, of 10 of you, some of you are going to draw the line at 1, some of you will draw the line at 3, some of you will draw the line at 5, Some of you will draw the line at 7. Some of you will draw the line at 9. And it's going to be different for all of you. If, in your estimation, public health, safety, and welfare, not having those trains going across that crossing trumps the rest, that's your vote.
Does all 12 have to be specifically addressed, though, in the document?
All 12 usually need to be addressed in one way, shape, or form, but that can be brief. What I think really matters more than addressing all 12 is some indication that all 12 were considered, number one, and number two, some concise statement of the reasons. And I think what I tried to give you when I said that brief 3-item summary of that is a statement of the reasons. If you were a judge looking at the thing, I will tell you right now, on findings of fact, it is almost impossible for a lawyer to get a judge to overturn a planning board finding. It has to be glaring, okay? I guess I'll say two things, and I don't mean to sound obnoxious. To my knowledge, Nick Kaufman, myself, maybe Andy Fisher, and 2 other people, in all of these things that we've done, I don't ever remember losing one to the planning office. And I don't remember Nick ever losing one. I don't remember Andy ever losing one. On a variance application, a rezoning request, can you think of one, Pat? Any of you? Ole's. 1. How many years is Nick? 10 years? 12 years? Okay, that's 1. You see what I'm saying? And the reason that results there is not because of the fact that you have a bad staff, because you have a great staff. The reason that results there is because they, I think, are oriented to sort of saying no, first of all, and secondly, because the rest of the facts, in your mind, affect things a great deal. And by walking in and throwing out those other facts, right there you're looking at them, that result gets changed. That's how it happens. I think if you have those facts and lay them out one at a time, the conclusions you arrive at are going to be a lot better. It will be defensible. It is impossible to get a judge to go back and question the planning board's interpretation of the facts. If that record said we looked at the neighborhood, we considered its density, we considered its history, where it's going, and the need for storage on the site, and what's adjacent to this residential property, I cannot think of a single court opinion I have ever read that says a judge would overturn that. They would not do it. Judges say the planning board heard the witnesses, the planning board heard the evidence, the record indicates they did that, they listened to it, and they gave deference to one particular fact. And that's enough to uphold the decision.
A technical question. Then, if we have a motion in front of us, and we find 11 yeses and 1 small no, or if we have 11 yeses and 1 big no, we might ignore the small no, and we might make the large no overbalance the rest. And we don't have to change anything.
I don't think you have to change anything at all. I think all you have to do is change the 1 or the 2 and make it clear that you agree with the rest of the findings. But this one issue overweighs the rest so substantially that that's the decision you have.
And as long as it's in the record, it's in the minutes that somebody said that, and everybody else voted their conscience.
That's all you need to do.
Done.
Yep. But you need to have the reasons. Now, I want to go all the way back to where I started an hour and a half ago, and we should take a break for about 10 minutes. We should have taken it 20 minutes ago. Go all the way back to where we started. The tummy test. Okay? When you come to that decision at the end, remember the first thing I said to do, I think the first thing all of you agree with is go back and ask your gut what should happen here. That's what you expect your staff to do when they write this recommendation out. Okay? That's what you're asking them to do. And I know that's how they do it. And I know a lot of them can't admit a lot of stuff that goes on. And I haven't talked to any of these people about it, which lets everybody off the hook. I know that's what happens a lot of the time. Take the tummy test when you get through with those findings and say, now, in my gut, is it a reasonable conclusion? Is that reason I wrote down that's that one item, is that the reason why I'm saying yes or no to that project? Is that enough? If your stomach feels nauseous, you better go back and do some work, folks, because you're right on the edge of getting in a lawsuit that you're not going to win, or at least being real uncomfortable. If your stomach at that point in time is saying that is enough, or those 3 reasons enough, or those 5 reasons are enough, and I put those things, or the board puts those things in the record, at that point in time, I think you're home free. You've done your job. And you've got a product that's explainable to John Q. Public who's never been through the proceeding before. When you hear no from a planning board and you don't hear a reason, I think if you didn't understand the system, it would be awful hard to listen to. I mean, I can't ever remember being in that position. Okay, I never have been, and I think a lot of you haven't been. But if you've been through high school, if you've worked your tail off at the mill for 10 years, if you've bought yourself 5 acres, and somebody now walks in and says, listen, you had a single-wide mobile home there, but you can't put a double-wide on it now because we rezoned it to say no mobile homes at this point in time, and you're increasing your non-conforming use and that's not allowable. Do you need to have a legitimate reason, a palatable reason for explaining that to that person? You bet you do. And in your gut, when you say no, in that findings of fact, you better have the reasons there that justify what's in your stomach. Or that person's going to go away a real unhappy camper, and that isn't what you provided. That isn't what you're there to do at all.
Unfortunately, I feel that, you know, and I can say this as a newcomer, that the planning board would be more sensitive to that individual as they came in. And I would feel that the council, when they heard this, would be less sensitive to something like that. That particular issue
I think you're right.
we're talking about
I think you're right.
now.
I think you're right. I guess the two things I'd offer, if the planning board puts in its findings the other information it gets at its hearing, what you do is probably guarantee to a greater degree that there's more consistency from this board to the city council or this board to the county commissioners. Okay? What you in essence do by writing in those other reasons, by saying this is what we know, this is what we heard, this is why we make this decision, is you provide for the other governmental entities which make the final decision the reasons to do that. The quality of your product directly affects the quality of theirs. No question, the job you do. I think the other thing it does is it takes you guys off the hook. And I've seen this board ask its people, why did you come up with that decision? Well, the reason they came up with it is they sat, they looked at the facts, and that was their decision. You may think it's stupid, you may disagree with it, but that's the way they interpret the facts. And I think if you're going to ask them to do that, questioning their judgment isn't the thing that you do. And I don't think they should be asked in the first place, because to me, them bringing you a conclusion appears to be unfair.
Whoever decided to do it this way.
I have no idea.
Then that's what it was.
What I'm trying to do, I mean, when I talked to Mike about this, my objective was twofold. He told me, talk to people about findings of fact. Okay? So what, I mean, we're trying to get to tonight is, one, how to write them, and two, I think what a presentation like this needs to do is appeal to your inner gut sense of what's right and what's wrong and how. So I can give you the 9 things that you have to do from procedural due process. That's easy. Anybody can, you know, check the boxes. Did I publish in the Missoulian? Check. Did I send a certified letter? Check. Did I write a finding of fact? Check. That isn't enough. Okay? At least if you're doing a good job, that isn't enough.
Don't we also have to admit that some people are going to go away unhappy?
Sure, you do. There's no doubt. Okay? But you ought to be able to look at the neighbor that comes back to you next week or writes a letter to the editor and say, the reason for the decision was bink, bink, bink. We heard these things. That right downstream from this proposed pig farm, okay?
Well, I think that's a lot of it. I mean, even if they go away unhappy, if they know the reason
Why?
they're going to go away a lot happier. I mean, at least they understand where you're coming from, and, you know, so I think that's a really major issue.
I think the other thing is this. Making your staff come up with a recommendation, one, compromises the faith that a person that applies to the board with can have in that person. Because whose side is there a chance that Zoe or Catherine or Barbara is going to be on? Okay? If you guys are going to say no to my proposal, you know, where do we go from there? I mean, automatically they're, to a person who's a newcomer, the enemy. So number one, you eliminate any positive working withness, you eliminate compromise, you eliminate proposed unique creative ideas. Number two, you put yourself in the position of either disagreeing with your staff, which looks wonderful in the record, I assure you. I mean, how many people tonight said, we change those all the time? You talked about the Board of Adjustment. We changed them all the time. Okay?
Change them, just obliterate.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. We didn't change them, we just, I mean, you see what I'm saying? So I think writing them is easy. I think the stuff that Bill's got in his mind, it's Ivan, isn't it? Ike, I'm sorry about that. What you came up, I mean, the things you're coming up with make sense. Okay? The ideas you've got for what facts were there in the background, saying, look, we haven't given notice, or there's this stream to this property we need to look at. Those things all matter. Those are facts. Those facts lead you to these conclusions that you have to make.
Is there a problem, like, after the public hearing's closed, or if we ask staff, what do you think? Is there a problem with that?
If you ask who?
The
Staff.
No, there isn't.
Staff.
I don't see anything wrong with having a staff recommendation in the proposal or a staff conclusion. But I think you're polluting. I mean, to me, this is on the edge of pollution to you. And I'm not trying to pick on the staff, and I'm not trying to pick on whoever wrote this, and I'm not trying to pick on that process. When I read this thing and thought last week about how can I talk to you about findings of fact, I went through this, and there's two, let me just... There's one thing in that list that's a factual question to me. The way those questions are worded, one thing is a fact. Does it or does it not comply with a comprehensive plan? Everything else takes facts, says, now given these facts, we want a conclusion. Given these facts, we want a conclusion. Okay? I think the reason you're having trouble changing these is that you're having trouble articulating changing the conclusion.
But if you look at the questions and what you said, it doesn't promote us providing facts. I mean, look at some of the wording, adequate light and air.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do you define this? A lot of these can't be defined. So how can you get facts when you really are dealing with ambiguity in the first place?
I think you are, but I think the way to handle that is don't change these, but instead list the facts relative to that point that you're using to make your conclusion. What does staff do now? Barb, Catherine, Zoe, all of you at this point in time go out and gather facts relative to these particular criteria. And then to make this decision, you employ those facts in your mind and say, okay, I decide it does this. Okay? What I think should be listed here, and I think what you were saying earlier, Bill, about the various things that are there that you can't articulate, is that those facts don't get listed in this report. What the report lists is the conclusions. If the facts are listed, you end up in a lot better position. Whether the staff does that or not is an internal policy, whatever decision. I think what the planning board needs to be concerned with is if you're going to change this thing, what you need to list are just the facts. Go back again to what I just wrote, and I found it really easy. That the adjacent uses to this property are not compatible with residential zoning, which uses include 1, a busy public street, 2, a railroad track adjacent, 3, unsightly buildings of industrial use adjacent to the property. Facts? All 3 of them. 2, that the neighborhood density has increased in the past 15 years. And 3, that a need for some individual or industrial zone property in the neighborhood is necessary to provide for storage facilities, etc., for increased dense development in the neighborhood. The last one's a conclusion, but I mean, bink, bink, bink. Those are the facts that matter.
You might even get an argument on the unsightly building.
Uh-huh.
You know, as we were saying earlier.
You might.
that somebody would say, well, I've looked at such and such all my life, and it doesn't bother me.
Right. I think my response would be, you're right. Maybe the conclusion the building's unsightly is a conclusion. Is it appropriate to have a residential area look out on an industrial area? Generally, no. So you might want to phrase it that way. With no buffer between the two, that might be the way to put it.
Yeah, 'cause, you know,
Okay?
here's a decision.
Yeah.
You always have a boundary. What I mean is,
Yeah.
you
Gotta
can
have one.
see, unless you just put in a row of trees or something
Yeah.
like that.
But if, I mean, row trees, whatever is appropriate. Maybe some sort of creative zoning at the site for phase-in area or transition zone or whatever is appropriate. Okay? The problem that you're looking at then is you're trying to change conclusions. I think that's the difficulty in it. What the planning board should concern itself with in terms of the law, okay, not opinion, but in terms of the law, is coming up with the facts which justify your conclusion. Those facts are traffic turns, those facts are fire truck response time, those facts are sewage provided to the site, those facts are water availability, whatever things you're looking at. Okay? And often that is just one thing. The fact that industrial products cross this railroad crossing in motor vehicles and cross this railroad crossing in trains leads to a risk of substantial accident, which risk is so great we elect to close a railroad crossing. Simple, easy, straightforward.
One of the things that has come up a lot, at least to my mind, is where an issue will come up in the process of discussion, or somebody raises it, who's at the meeting, and we don't have the facts. In other words, it has not been addressed in the report. And then, my mind goes, well, do we just forge ahead no matter what, or do we somehow stop here and say, somebody go out and find out? Or you'll get two different versions of the facts. Somebody will say, no, there's only 100 a day, and the other person says it's 1,000, and so there's a disagreement. I'm not clear how to deal with that.
What do you put in the report? Somebody says there's 100 a day. If there's 100 a day, you're going to allow the rezoning. If there's 1,000 a day, you're not. What do you put in the report?
I don't know.
You're going to tell me. What are you going to put in the report? Are you going to allow the rezoning?
Not until further facts are made.
Okay. If you're not going to make a decision, then what you're going to say is we defer this to a later point in time. If at the later point in time the testimony still is, go look at the rezoning application for the mall sometime. And I think the comment is construction of this facility at this site will lead to no additional traffic congestion or need for control device. And it's something like that. I can't remember the exact conclusion, but it's in the record. Okay? Go back and look at that stuff. When you look at that, if you're going to allow the rezoning, which fact does it mean you accept? There's 1,000 or there's 100? So if you say we're going to allow the rezoning, what should be in the factual conclusion? We accept the testimony that this will increase turns by 100 or 1,000. We deny the proposed rezoning because we accept the testimony, or we believe credible testimony indicates, whatever statement you want to use, that 1,000 vehicles a day will turn at this location, which is an undue increase in congestion. Okay? The facts aren't always going to agree. I mean, I lost my poster I wanted to bring you tonight. Besides the Holmes quote, I have a wonderful poster of a bunny rabbit. And what I can do with this poster is stick it in a bag, show it to half the room, and describe a bunny rabbit. Everybody looks at it and they know what it is. When you turn it around and you take the same poster out of the bag and describe a seagull, the ears on the rabbit and the head and the nose become the beak, the eye, and the head. And the other half of the room always sees a seagull. When you stick it up on the wall, half of you see a gull and half of you see a rabbit. But you're both looking at the same picture. That's all you saw in the beginning. Same deal. And I think you've got to decide, is it a rabbit or is it a seagull? Okay? Questions on findings?
I think we're capable of doing that for the most part. I think we've had some trouble, though, trying to articulate that issue.
Well, it's hard. And where I perceive that problems come from is what you've been working off of is the conclusions.
Right.
Okay? So back yourself up to the facts themselves, and I think you'll find this is a lot easier. A whole lot easier. One other caveat, and I thought about how to talk about this, and it's not in any of the material. What I've heard in the past from people is that once you get to the point of you've made a decision, that next of all you deal with writing the findings of fact. I think if the vote's 5-4, you have a problem agreeing on what the facts are. Okay? I think you owe it to yourselves to internally arrive at some conclusion about how we're going to write facts. Because if the decision's 5-4, the decision's made, which means the other 4 of you that are on the losing side of the vote have nothing to gain by putting findings of fact in there which don't promote the cause. Okay? So I think if you're going to vote on the findings or adopt them, or if you made the motion and you come up with the findings of fact, you've got to have some sense of unity about, okay, that was the vote on the issue, now we're united again and headed on our merry way as the planning board with the decision. And I don't want to talk about that, I just want to let you think about that and leave you with that thought. Okay? 2 other things on procedural due process that Smith talks about in his handout. 3 other things that are equally important. Number 6, conflict of interest and the appearance of conflict or impropriety can't exist in the proceeding. Conflict of interest comes in a variety of ways. I think 1, who you talk to clearly affects conflict of interest, okay? Beforehand, if you're talking to the right or the wrong people, if you work for the wrong people, do you potentially have a conflict of interest? You bet you do, okay? Go to work for Washington Construction and then try to rezone a railroad track. Conflict of interest? Oh, well, maybe not. What about if you work for Montana Rail Link? Yeah, no question at all, okay? Number 2, how you talk to those people, I think, creates the appearance of impropriety. When you call Wally at a planning board meeting who's on one side of an issue and somebody who's never been there is on the other side, does that appear to be a conflict of interest? When you call Nick, when you call Andy, okay? I mean, it's a small feature, it's a small issue, and I don't think it is a conflict of interest on its face. I'm not worried about what it is in reality. I'm worried about, to the guy who walks in the door who's not been here before, what does it look like? And to them, it looks really bad. The same way it would look really bad if you were the person applying and walked in a new town and everybody knew everybody else by name. Thirdly, when you talk to people is important. As far as an apparent conflict, when you worked it for them, when the zoning application came in, when the information came down, when the people got together. Fourthly, the easy ones. Do you have an interest in the project? If you own the land to be rezoned, do you happen to have a conflict of interest? If you own the subdivision land being reviewed, do you happen to have a conflict of interest? Those are easy, okay?
Those are the simple kind.
Yeah, those are easy.
Those are easy. You probably all know the answers to things like that. But if you're a business person and you sell to that firm who's seeking the rezoning, how do you feel about that?
I love it. We're going to get there.
That's the kind of
That's the second to last one. Do you have an interest in the neighborhood? Not do you own the land being divided, do you live next door? Do you live 3 houses away? Do you live 5 houses away? Do you live 8 houses away? And lastly, instead of that, do you know the applicant or do you do business with the applicant? Okay? Those are the 2 really hardest ones. Nobody here works for American Asphalt, do they? Let's call it John Doe Paving. You're on the planning board, John Doe Paving. What does John Doe Paving do in Missoula County, Montana? They pave roads in what? Subdivisions. Do you have an interest in getting lots of subdivisions approved? You bet. John Doe Plumbing Company. Let's pick on the plumbing companies for a minute. What does John Doe Plumbing Company do to houses, or for houses, or in houses? John Doe Plumbing Company plumbs them. Does John Doe Plumbing Company have an interest in lots of subdivisions in Missoula County, Montana? Because is John Doe Plumbing going to get lots of new contracts to put plumbing in houses? Okay? Architecture firms, and you thought you were going to get off on this, didn't you?
I knew it wasn't.
I mean, you know, where do you draw the line? There comes a point in time that none of you can serve on this board, okay? So I think it's got to be reasonable. I mean, there's a line out there, and that's where the difficulty comes. How far does it go? Rule of thumb, a couple things. Look in your stomach. If you feel like, if you walked in the same circumstance, you would be being treated unfairly. If, according to Fasano, go back a while, we talked about that. Criteria number 4, the appearance of fairness doctrine. If you feel it appears unfair, it appears too chummy-chummy, it appears too inappropriate, you've got a problem. And at that point in time, probably you should do something different. Of more concern than when there is a conflict, to me comes the issue of what do you do about it? If you own the property, how do you